only two interpretations really that can be held about Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. One of those we call the strict chronology interpretation, and one of those we call the gap chronology interpretation. And it was in William Henry Green's article, Primeval Chronology, written in 1863, published in 1890, that questions were first systematically raised concerning the strict chronology interpretation of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. He disputed the popular opinion that we could go from Adam, Genesis 5:3, all the way through the end of Genesis 5 to the flood, and we could count up a total of 1,656 years, all inclusive, with nothing being left out. Nor could we go to chapter 11 from the flood to Abram and end up with 292 years. So some of the things that we are looking at, some of them, not all of them, some of the things that we're looking at are based upon some of the thoughts that were first put forward to the public by William Henry Green. But it's interesting that even according to the strict chronology interpretation, we're going to have to end up with more years than 6,099. Now you should be wondering why, because we spent some time last week going right through the chapters, not skipping over any of the fathers or any of the sons and adding up all of the numbers that we were given. When you add those up, 1656, 292, and then the two that we get after Abram, we have 6,099 years. And we're not talking right now, yet, about gap chronology interpretation, just strict chronology interpretation. And even according to that, there are more than these 6,099 years. Now, of course, what we find there when we look at some passages here in a moment and add our years to 6,099, not only would that be true according to the strict chronology interpretation, but that puts questions in our minds whether or not there could be more years that perhaps are somewhere either between Adam and the flood or between the flood and Abram that don't appear right here in the passage on the surface. Now, as someone has commented on since our last teaching, it is rather interesting and pretty near impossible that we can only have a period of 292 years between the flood and Abram. That's why we've given you the figures again so you can keep them before you. We're talking about Noah, the time of Noah to the time of Abraham, just 300 years. And as someone else has correctly remarked since then, we haven't really gotten to the place yet where we've proven that one interpretation is more correct or is better over another. Strict chronology, gap interpretation. We've not gotten to the place where we've proven. We've just given some suggestions that point away from, but not necessarily to anything, but away from strict chronology interpretation. Some of those thoughts were the following. We'll have to lead up to the one where we left you hanging in the balances, where we didn't get to answer all of what we were saying under that point. In the first place, we said the numbers weren't totaled up. Then in the second place, we said that both of the genealogies in 5 and 11 are perfectly symmetrical. You have 10 patriarchs. The last one has 3 important sons. Then in the third place, we said that much additional information irrelevant to a strict chronology interpretation is given to us in these chapters. And then the one that we left you on, you can either go back to your notes or just be catching up now. Number 4, it appears that many of these sons are not firstborn sons, but they're messianic links. And so we were looking at some things under this thought. I don't remember whether this was one of them. It doesn't seem like it was proposed by Green, but it's been proposed by others since then, taking their cue from William Henry Green. It appears that many of the sons aren't firstborn, but they're messianic links. Let's look at here in Genesis, over in chapter 16, verse 16. a whole long list of important people with important fathers, but who aren't firstborn children or who aren't messianic links. You've got one or the other, but not both of them together. Genesis 16:16. Abram was 86 old when Hagar bare Ishmael to him. So he's 86. Then verse 1 of chapter 17. When he's 99, almost 100 years old, then God appears to him. I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. And he goes on here to change his name. And then to say in verse 7, I'll establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee. I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art, to stranger all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. He goes on in verse 15 to speak similar things concerning the change of Sarai's name to Sarah. Then Abraham falls down on his face in verse 17 and laughs and says, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? Amen. Because that would mean if Sarah's getting pregnant right about now, he would be about 100 when he's born, although he's 99 when all of this is going on. And shall Sarah, that is 90 years old, bear? So she must have been 89 then. And Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. Amen. So Ishmael is the firstborn of the sons of Abram, and Isaac is the secondborn. But the firstborn's not the important son, it's the secondborn son that's important, and who's the messianic link. Then in chapter 25 of Genesis, in verse 25, where we have two children being born now. The first came out red all over like a hairy garment. You know who that was. They called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob, the supplanter. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. He was 40 when he got married and waited 20 years until he was 60. And he has his first two children, Esau, firstborn son, Jacob, secondborn son, but Jacob, the important son, serving as the messianic link. Then in chapter 29, verses 32 through 35, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, 29:35, Judah, the fourthborn son, but the messianic link. Then in 38:29, again two children being born, boy twins again. Came to pass as the first child drew back his hand, the hand came out first, and then the child's hand was drawn back, that behold his brother came out. She said, hast thou broken forth this breach, or how hast thou broken forth this breach be upon thee? Therefore his name was Perez, or Pharez. And afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, which means he was the firstborn, and his name was called Zerah. Zerah was the firstborn, but not the messianic linked, as you run the references to the other child in verse 29. Then over in 1 Samuel 16, in verse 11, Samuel, the old prophet, says to Jesse, are here all thy children, all 7 of them? He said, there remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth sheep. Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down until he has come hither. So he wasn't the second or the third or the fourth. He's the 8th born, the last one. But he's the messianic link. In other words, it's fairly interesting that throughout Scripture, the firstborn's not so important after all as far as the Messiah was concerned. He was the important one as far as a lot of natural and earthly and parental blessings were concerned, assuming that he didn't give them up like Esau did, but he's not the important child as far as the messianic line in the Old Testament was concerned. Now, turning back to Genesis chapter 5, that's not only true outside of our two passages, but it's true right in these two passages, that we have sons that we are specifically told mentioned here who are not firstborn sons. Genesis 5 and verse 3. Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image and called his name Seth, and he was born after two sons were born, Cain and Abel. So Seth would have to be at least the third-born son. But his name, not righteous Abel, he was slain, and certainly not wicked Cain. He was banished from the earth. Righteous Seth, his name is put in here as a messianic link, but he's the third-born son. Then over in chapter 5, verse 32, the sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, Japheth. Chapter 10, verse 21, unto Shem also, the father of all the sons of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. So Japheth is the elder of the sons, and Shem would have to be the second or the third-born son. And so he's not firstborn, but in chapter 11 and verse 10, notice through whom the genealogy is traced, not Japheth and not Ham, but either the second or the third-born, depending on how you interpret the other passages, which we showed you he was the second-born. These are the generations of Shem. Then in chapter 11 and verse 10 as well, Shem begat a son, Arpachshad. Verse 11, then the genealogy is traced through Arpachshad. Then back over in chapter 10, verse 22. The sons of Shem were Elam, perhaps the firstborn, Asher, perhaps the secondborn, and Arpachshad, perhaps the thirdborn. But evidently not the firstborn, since he's not mentioned first in this little small list of the sons. So there are three cases, without even going into any detail, to show in these two chapters that at least some, if not half, if not many, if not all, of the sons which are mentioned are not firstborn sons. They're mentioned because they're messianic links. Now the name we had stopped with was Abraham. This brings us right now up to date with where we were last week. And if you'll turn over to chapter 11, verses 26 and 27, we begin for a few moments looking at Abraham. Abram still at this time, Abraham, it really makes no difference. And Terah lived 70 years, begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Well, what are we to assume here? That Abram was firstborn, Nahor was secondborn, Haran was thirdborn? Or are we to assume, as the text evidently says, that in Terah's 70th year, he had triplets? Abram, Nahor, and Haran. That's what this verse would say, that in the 70th year of Terah, he had 3 sons born that year. And he's only got one wife, we know that. It'll go on to say that in the next few verses. We know he's only got one wife, so the only way you can get that is have triplets, all of them born in this 70th year of Terah. These are the generations of Terah. Terah begat, and here they're in the same order. Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. The 3 names again. Which is the firstborn of the sons? Which is the middle? Which is the last one? Even if we have triplets, you still have a firstborn. Someone has to come out first. But we're still looking at 2 different questions. Who's firstborn, who's second, who's third? And were they all born on the same day? Triplets, all at the same time. That's what the passage would appear to say. Well, we have to skip on down to verse, we'll have to read the passage. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, and Ur of the Chaldees. Now, Haran's name is the name mentioned last, but he's the one who dies first. Generally, the firstborn is the one who dies first because he's older than the other children. So it's interesting that the last name is mentioned as the one who dies first. So the only two sons left, Abram and Nahor, took them wives. Now, are we to assume then that they weren't even married? If you look down in verse 27, Haran's already married and already had a son named Lot. Then Haran dies here in verse 28, and then Abram, Nahor took them wives. Were they still so young when Haran died that they weren't married, which would obviously mean Haran would be the firstborn son. But in verse 26 and 27, his name is mentioned last. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran. So here Haran's got another child, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren and had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. They went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. They came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, according to chapter 11 and verse 26, he's 70 whenever the sons are born. He dies when he's 205, so he lived another 135 years. What does that say? Well, we have to go on into chapter 12. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curses you, and in thee will all the families of the earth be blessed. So, after the Lord had said, verses 1 to 3, Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. So he's still in Haran at this time, and he's departing when he's 75 years old. Now you have to keep that in mind with 1126 and 1132. Now if Terah is 70 years old, according to 1126, whenever Abram is born, then whenever Terah dies in 1132 at the age of 205, then Abram would have to be 135 years old. If Terah is 70 when Abram's born, then we'd have to ask, if Terah dies when he's 205, then how old is Abram? Well, he'd be 135. 12:4 mentions the age 75, but does 12:4 parallel with 1132? It doesn't say that here in this passage. So turn over to the New Testament. We'll see what the New Testament says about that question. Acts chapter 7 are the first few verses there. We are slowly on our way to proving one or the other. 7 verses 1 to 4, Acts 7. Then said the high priest to Stephen, Are these things so? He said, Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt, well, the sea shouldn't be there, at Haran. They just added a sea there, but it's still the same word, Haran. Now, Stephen says that the God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. So that takes us way back in those earlier verses that we looked at there in chapter 11, because he's been here by 1132 a long time, evidently, because God appeared to him while he was still in Mesopotamia long before he got there, and they got there, and it says there in chapter 11 of Genesis that when they arrived, they dwelt there. So that would appear to be a long period of time. Acts 7:3. And he said unto him, Get thee out of thy country, Evidently while he's still in Mesopotamia, in other words. Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from... well, it doesn't say it exactly like chapter 12. I'm quoting chapter 12 of Genesis. And come into the land which I will show thee. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. Now we're told here very clearly that he didn't move from Haran until his father was dead. So that means that yes, the age 75 of Abram parallels with the death age of Terah of 205. Now if you just do a little subtracting, you subtract Abraham's age, 75, from the age of Terah when Terah dies, 205, then how old was Terah whenever Abram was born? 130. But you see, according to Genesis 11:26, Terah lived 70 years, and when he was 70, he begat Abram. But if Abram is 75 when his father dies at 205, then his father was 130 whenever he had his son, 60 years later than 1126 and this age of 70 for the patriarch Terah. What that means is Abram obviously is not the firstborn. He's probably not the secondborn. He's probably the last of these three sons. Haran, as we've already intimated, verse 28 of chapter 11, is no doubt the firstborn because he dies first, and he's already been married before the other ones were married. Nahor would be the secondborn son. Abram would have been the thirdborn son. But if you're just reading along here and you see 11:26, it appears that Abram is firstborn, and that he was born whenever Terah, his father, was 70. But he wasn't born until Terah, his father, was 130. Haran was born when Abram was 70. Nahor was born, we'll just take a middle number, when he was 100, 30 this way and 30 that way. And then Abram was finally born whenever Terah was 130.
Praise the Lord.
Now going back to chapter 11, we counted from verse 10 down through verse 26, from the flood to Abram, a total of 292 years. But that was assuming that Terah was 70 whenever Abram was born. Now we know he's 130. So what we're saying is right away we know we're missing 60 years that you have to add to that period that I gave you of 292 years, which gives us 352 years between the flood and Abram. That on the surface doesn't even appear here. But when you look a little deeper, you find an additional 60 years. Because whenever we were counting from 11:10 through 11:26, we were assuming that Terah was 70 whenever he bore his firstborn son, who was Abram, or perhaps when he had triplets. But it still doesn't matter as long as Abram was born then. But since we know that's not true, we've got 60 more years to add to that period of 292 to give us 352 years. That's 60 more years that we would have been missing in this genealogy if we took on the surface the strict chronology interpretation. Because we would have worked our way from Terah when he was 70 right down to Abram and would have missed 60 years in the genealogy. Now there are a couple of small details we will look at before we mention the importance of that point. Over in chapter 5, whenever we gave you that first figure of 1,656 years, what did it go from and to? Well, it went from Adam to the flood, or that's what we said. But did we not really count from the birth of Seth until the time of the flood? Well, go back to chapter 5, verse 3, and you'll see, no. Adam lived 130 years, and then he begat Seth. So we did include here that 130-year period before the time when Seth was born. Now it says Adam lived 130 years after what? Well, obviously after he was created. Since on each of the other sons, like in verse 6, says Seth lived 105 years. 105 after what? Well, after he was born. Until this son mentioned was born. So when it says in verse 3 that Adam lived 130 years, it means 130 years after he was created. Now that's a surprising figure to think that they're supposed to be repopulating the earth at this time, because they've already lost one child. They had two and they lost one. They got to at least get that one back. And we've had a 130-year period. Somewhere in there, perhaps no doubt closer to the beginning of that period, Cain and Abel were born. Then a lot of things evidently transpired between whenever Abel was slain and whenever Seth is born, 130 years after Genesis 2, after creation. But that is included. If that wasn't included at that period, where Cain and Abel were growing up and then Cain slaying Abel is not included, then we'd of course have to add in some more years. Then another small detail is over in chapter 11 and verse 10. The first step in the chronology was from Adam to the flood, and the second step was from the flood to Abram. Well, from Adam to the beginning of the flood or to the end of the flood? And from the beginning of the flood or from the end of the flood until Abram? Because depending on which way you answer those questions, you can end up with plus or minus 1 year. That's not a great amount, but still, to be technical, plus or minus 1 year. Well, chapter 11, verse 10 tells us that we counted the year of the flood, and remember that the flood lasted a year. And we counted that in on our second step from the flood to Abram, not on the first step. That was from Adam to the beginning of the flood. And then from the beginning of the flood to Abram for our second step, which counts that 1 year of the flood. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arpachshad. We've dealt with this passage earlier, 2 years after the flood. But again, the question is, after what? The beginning or the end? If you're saying 2 years after the end, then it's been 3 years since the flood began. If you're saying 2 years since the beginning of the flood, then all you've got is 2 years. And the passage obviously means 2 years after the beginning of the flood, which means we're not missing that 1 year that some people might assume we could be missing here by not counting the flood. But getting back to the firstborn sons, really what's the significance then of at least some of these names, all the ones that we can prove we've looked at so far, not being firstborn sons, but we know being messianic links. Any of the names here are messianic, so we're not guessing at who's messianic and who's not. Any of them who get in the list are messianic names because they are links in the messianic line in the Old Testament. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're all firstborn. But what does that matter? As long as you don't have any overlapping, and as long as you don't have any gaps between them, then it doesn't matter if you go from the firstborn to the second, and then from that second-born child to his fifth-born child, as long as there's no overlapping and as long as there's no gap. Because if you've got overlapping, then you're going to have a shorter amount of time because you're going to be counting both of those when really you shouldn't be. And if you have a gap, you're going to have a longer period of time because you're missing some years, let's say, between the firstborn and between the second-born son. So what's the significance then of that? Does it really prove anything? Well, yes, it certainly does, according to the implication that we get in chapter 11 and verse 26. Evidently, these ages that are mentioned are the ages when the father had his firstborn child. But it doesn't mean that the name of the son mentioned there is the firstborn son. Now, there'd be no way you could get that without 11:26, because we know in 11:26 the important name is Abram. So leaving the other names out for a moment, it would appear to say that when Terah was 70 years old, then he had Abram. Or the way they say it back here in chapter 5, Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram. Okay, that's true. He lived 70 years and begat Abram. That's not saying that he begat Abram when he was 70. You see, that's an entirely different statement. It can say that he begat that son when he was that age, or it can say that he lived to that age and begat that son, but he may not have begat him for 60 years after the age that's mentioned there. What does that tell us? In every one of these sons, since perhaps none of them are firstborn, in every one of these sons we could have a short amount of time, no long centuries, but a short amount, 50 here, 40 there, 30 there, 60 there, 80 there. A short amount of time totally missing that there's no way we can figure out what it is. What would that do? Stretch our time out way beyond that 6,099. Or now that we've added 6 years to it, that's 6,159, the 60 years we added to it. Now you have to update that total, that general total we gave you, from 6,099 to 6,159, because we added 60 years to it. Now the only way you can get this is 1126. So let me show you what I mean. If we go back up to verse 24 of this chapter. Nahor lived 29 years, and he begat a son, and then whenever he was 50, he had Terah. That very well could have been what happened here. But when we count up the years, all we count up is the 29. Because we just assume that the age and the name of the son correspond. When in fact, according to 1126, they don't necessarily correspond. The age and the name of the son.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the...
Because we just assume that the age and the name of the son correspond. When in fact, according to 1126, they don't necessarily correspond. The age and the name of the son. Abram's is the important name here. The age 70, they don't correspond at all. 130 corresponds with Abram, but not 70. So that means that on every one of these, think if we were missing 50 years and you've got 20 generations, you're going to add up hundreds of years that we're missing. Now that, without going any further, is a proof that we have gaps here in the chronology. Things aren't given to us so that we can count from point A to point B without missing any years. Because if you weren't given, I could even make it really specific, if you weren't given Acts 7, 1-4, then there's no way that we could tell that Terah was 130 rather than 70 whenever Abram was born. Because here in 11 and 12, we're not told specifically, like we are in chapter 7 of the book of Acts, that the death of Terah at 205 corresponded with the move of Abram from Haran to Canaan at the age of 75. We're not told those things correspond in time except over in Acts 7. So if we didn't have Acts 7, we wouldn't know it. If we didn't have 11:32 and 12:4, then we wouldn't have even gotten on the trail to begin with. That's what gets you on the trail to begin with, is 11:32 and 12:4 of Genesis. And then it takes you over to the book of Acts to find out, now, do those two periods, or those two texts, we could say 11:32 and 12:4 correspond with each other. And of course there we find out that they do. So what we're saying is the age doesn't necessarily correspond with the son given, because the age that is mentioned, no doubt, is the age of the father when he has his firstborn son. And if the son mentioned is not the firstborn, and it could well be not the firstborn, then we're missing an untold amount of years, although it's still small. Remember, we're not missing billions of years or something. It's still a small amount of time. But it ruins 6,099 or 6,159 or 4,004 BC. It ruins all those. Why? Because it's impossible to figure out any date specifically. You could talk in general numbers, but you can't talk 6,100 or 7,100 or 8,200 or 8,546. You can't talk about numbers like that because we're missing too many numbers here. Now let's go back to chapter 5 and just pick out an example. Again, I can prove from chapter 5 as well as from chapter 11 we have at least one name that's told us who's not a firstborn son. And that's not counting Noah's 3 sons, which, by the way, remember in 532 are listed Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But that doesn't mean that Shem was born whenever Noah was 500. So there's an example that's obvious that we've already covered before, because we know that Shem wasn't the firstborn son. But in chapter 5, Seth has his son named Enos. Verse 9. Enos lived 90 years and begat Cainan. Does it say that he begat Cainan when he was 90? No. It could mean that. In 5:3 it does mean that Adam was 130 whenever Seth was born. But in chapter 5 and verse 32, Noah was 500 years old. Noah begat Shem. Does it mean that when Noah was 500 he begat Shem? No. He begat Japheth whenever he was 500. Does it mean that he begat all of them whenever he was 500 triplets? No. So in chapter 5 and verse 9, Enos lived 90 years. Does that mean he begat Cainan when he was 90? No. He had a son when he was 90. You can be certain on that. And that was his firstborn son when he was 90. It could have been Cainan. It could not have been Cainan. If it wasn't Cainan, then we're missing years again. If it was, no problem. We just add them up and get 1,656 years. But if it wasn't Cainan, if it just says that, and you see, the Bible would expect us to know some other portions of Scripture to be able to get the hint here. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the hint that just because a number of years is mentioned alongside the name of a son doesn't mean they correspond with each other. It would expect us to realize that in the Old Testament setup, the firstborn son was an important son. He was called the son of the man's strength. And the age of the man whenever he had his firstborn son was an important year. That's when he began to beget a line, not daughters, but a male line that would follow in his line and perpetuate itself. It was a very important year. So that would be significant enough just in mentioning the age of each one of these patriarchs when he had his firstborn son, regardless of whether or not the name of the son mentioned corresponded with the age given. Because that's an important year. Verse 9, Enos, his important year was 90. That's when he began to be a father. But he didn't necessarily father Cainan whenever he was 90, but it gives us 90 as his important age because this is when he begins to bear the seed that will carry on his line. Okay, let's go on to another internal proof. For that we will give you, let's see, this was the second of the two charts again, of the post-Diluvian patriarchs. And that is that there are at least a couple of very conspicuous permanent drops in lifespan and the life expectancy rate in chapter 11. The two figures with the asterisks by them, or with the question marks by them, and the percentage by them. Shem dies whenever he's 600. Arpachshad dies whenever he's 438. That's a drop 23% in life expectancy. And notice that it's not only a lifespan drop, but it's a permanent drop, because at no future time after these men do we get to someone who's back up to Shem's age of 600. Shem dies when he's 600. Arpachshad dies when he's 438 years old. 23% drop from the age of Shem when he died compared to Arpachshad. Now these are in chapter 11, not in chapter 5, but in chapter 11. Then even more remarkable than that, Eber is 464 when he dies. Peleg is 239 years old when he dies, a 45% drop between the age of Eber and his death and the age of Peleg. A drastic permanent drop in life expectancy and lifespan. That to us suggests that there were probably more names that fit between Shem and Arpachshad, more names that fit between Eber and Peleg, that made the drop in life expectancy not so drastic. It would have been spread out over a long period of time. Because drops like this simply don't happen. You always have unless you have a volcano or something that destroys everyone, and you figure in some catastrophic event that ruins the ratio and ruins your theory of life expectancy, it's always either gradually going up or gradually going down. You don't have a drastic drop in life expectancy. So how can we explain 23 and 45%? Probably Eber wasn't the father of Peleg. As simple as that. Eber was the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Perhaps not that many greats, perhaps more than that, of Peleg. And so the drop would have gone from 464 down to 420, and then down to 400, and then down to 375, work our way all the way down to 239. Because you see, once we get down here, it doesn't go back up to 400 again. Once we get to 438, it doesn't go back up to 600 again. It is a continual downward process working its way from these great ages, 600 down to 438, and 464 down to 239, but it doesn't go back up again. And so the suggestion is that we've got more people that fit in here. In other words, gaps. When it says Shem Arpachshad, when it says Eber Peleg, doesn't mean father, son. It means gap. Doesn't even mean father and fourth-born son. It means a larger gap with more years missing than just, let's say, 60. From Terah at 70 to Terah at 130, whenever Abram is born. Now, you don't find this type of drop on a permanent scale over in chapter 5. Why? Because the last name mentioned, Noah, goes right back up and surpasses the first name. Adam died at 930, Noah at 950. So there are drops for certain in chapter 5, but they aren't permanent. They fluctuate. They go up and down. But here is something that must be spread out over a long period of time, perhaps longer than chapter 5, because maybe Shem's son lived to be older than he did. That's no problem. But as we keep working down generation by generation, pretty soon, however far away and long away we are, when we get to Arpachshad, he's fallen all the way down to 438 years old when he dies, 23% drop. So the suggestion is that more people fit in between the two names of Shem and Arpachshad, and the two names of Eber and Peleg. All right, another internal thought and suggestion to consider, going beyond our chart now, that is the implied antiquity of the Tower of Babel. The implied antiquity of the Tower of Babel. Here's what we have. Abram was born 2167. According to our revised strict chronology interpretation of chapter 11, we revised it from 292 up to 352. According to our revised strict chronology interpretation of chapter 11, the flood was in the year 2519. You see, you can figure all this out if there's a strict chronology being followed. Abram born 2167. The flood was at 2519. In other words, 352 years before him. That means that the Tower of Babel would have been around, and there's no dates given precisely. We know that it was sometime during the lifetime of Peleg, but when during his lifetime we don't know. But the Tower of Babel was somewhere around the year 2300 BC. Now remember what the Tower of Babel is and signifies. This is the beginning of all of the cultures and nations and tongues and families and different peoples of the world and of the earth. If the tower was 2300 and Abram was born 2167, that's only a 133-year time period between the scattering at Babel and the birth of Abram. And it's only a 208-year time period from the Tower of Babel to Abram's entrance into Egypt. Now the point is, are we to assume that in only 208 years man had gone from nothing, the Tower of Babel, that was the beginning of the nations of the world, to this vast, complex country, nation, and civilization known as Egypt and the Egyptians? In only 208 years, No way. Only 133 years between the Tower of Babel and the birth of Abram. People are already traveling all over the world from Mesopotamia up to Haran, with their intent being to go from Haran now all the way down to Canaan. And we're assuming, as chapter 12 shows us, that Canaanites are already living in the land there after only 133 years. Let me show you some passages, such as in chapter 12, verses 14 to 16, where we find nations of the earth already being mentioned only 100 or 200 years after the Tower of Babel. And you keep in mind what we've said before, that the nations that were strong would have remained in that area, or the families that were strong that became the strong nations. The smaller clans and family units, the weaker ones, would have been pushed on the outside, gone into all the various parts of the world, taken years and years to get there. They had no fast means of transportation to get from Mesopotamia to North America. And once they got there, they lived a caveman type life until they became established there. And once they became established, it's going to take years to produce enough children to call a nation. I mean, we're talking about a nation of people, of hundreds of thousands and millions of people. That's going to take years for a family or a half a dozen families to produce that many people. So could all of that really have taken place in 133 or 208 years? It's highly improbable, if not totally impossible. Came to pass that when Abram was come into Egypt, then this is only 208 years after the Tower of Babel, according to strict chronology. So keep that in mind. Only 208 years have elapsed. Abram comes into a country that's already known by this name Egypt. The Egyptians beheld the woman that she was fair, princes, so they've got a high system of government with a pharaoh here. Princes also, Pharaoh saw her. A pharaoh and princes that work under him. Speaks of a vast governmental complex. Commended her before Pharaoh. The woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. He entreated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, he-asses, men-servants, maid-servants, she-asses, and camels. Could they really have had that type of animals living around them, domesticated, after only 208 years after the Tower of Babel? Then in chapter 13, verses 10 through 13, this is the account of Lot. He lifts up his eyes, looks down there at Sodom, and sees that Sodom, the land around Sodom, that Jordan River Valley is a good place to live. That's where he wants to go. Verse 12, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, but Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and he pitched his tent towards Sodom. That's where Lot was looking. The men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Another whole city of people here. Then in chapter 14, notice chapter 14. Came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, that Arioch, king of Elasar, and Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, and Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. Well, where did we get all these kings and cities and peoples after only 208 years between the Tower of Babel and the time of Abraham? Then in chapter 15, verses 18 through 21. The Lord tells Abraham to look, that he's given him all the land around him, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgasites, the Jebusites. It's hardly possible that we can already have these clans and nations of people after only 208 years. In other words, the implication is the Tower of Babel occurred hundreds of years before 2300 BC, which again is a direct proof against strict chronology interpretation, because we have to only be separated by a couple of hundred years from the time of the Tower of Babel if we're living whenever Abram is living. And besides that, contemporary pagan records show us that the dynasties of Egypt reached back way long before 2300 BC. They go back to 3000 BC, which means the Tower of Babel would have had to have been before 3000 BC. Egypt couldn't have been a nation until after the Tower of Babel. Other countries even go back further than that, back to 3500 BC. That would take the Tower of Babel back before 3500 BC. What have we just done? We just added in, just by doing that, 1,300 years. That you can only see by seeing the implication of turning from chapter 11, confusion of tongues, to chapter 12, Abraham going down to this complex political nation, Egypt, the greatest nation of the world at his day. That's only from chapter 11 to chapter 12 of Genesis. Are we to assume there are only a couple of years between those two chapters? That's hardly possible. There would have had to have been thousands of years between the early events in chapter 11 and all of the events in chapter 12 and the following chapters, which again implies that we're going to have a lot more time than strict chronology interpretation would provide for us. Then, seventh, and I believe a final internal thought, is the thought of the problem of contemporaries. We've got a chapter 5 contemporary, Methuselah, a chapter 11 contemporary, Abram. The problem of contemporaries. I'll show you what I mean as we look at each one of these. Methuselah and Abram. We'll begin with Methuselah, chapter 5, 25 through 29. Notice carefully, chapter 5, 25. Methuselah lived 187 years, according to strict chronology, and he had a son whose name was Lamech. Then he lived so long. Verse 28, Lamech lived 182 years, and then according to strict chronology interpretation, he had a son whose name was Noah. Are we to assume, verse 25, Methuselah, then he has, verse 28, Lamech, then Lamech has, verse 29, Noah. Are we to assume that Methuselah was the father of Lamech and the grandfather of Noah? That Lamech was the son of Methuselah and Noah was the grandson of Methuselah? Well, obviously from the passage that's what we're to assume, that Methuselah is the father of Lamech and he's the grandfather of Noah. How old was Methuselah then whenever Noah was born? Well, verse 25 plus verse 28. 369. Methuselah's 369 whenever Noah's born. When does the flood come? Chapter 7, verse 6, chapter 7, verse 11. The flood comes in the beginning of the 600th year of Noah's life. What age would Methuselah then be whenever the flood came? 969. 527. Your attention, please. All the days of Methuselah were 969. Does that mean we're to suppose that Methuselah swam around a year before he died? If the flood came in the beginning of that year and he lived to be 969, then he would have had to swim around for a while in the water before he finally drowned to death. His own grandson wouldn't let him on board the ark, and he would have drowned to death because the flood came in the same year that he died. And what's interesting is chapter 7, verse 1, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation, and he means of Noah and thee only. Well, then Methuselah was a pagan, and Lamech was a pagan. All these were pagans, if they're still living at this time. And that doesn't take into consideration any of the earlier names, just the name of Methuselah. He would have been swimming around a year, or at least part of the year, had to have been swimming around several months before he finally drowned in the waters. And his own grandson wouldn't let him on board the ark. Then over in chapter 11, the problem of contemporaries. You see, we've got a problem of contemporaries. The suggestion is more time elapsed between Methuselah and Noah. Noah was not the grandson of Methuselah. Lamech was probably not the son of Methuselah, and he was not the father of Noah. Keep that in mind, and we can prove more about that later. But turning over to chapter 11, here's what we have. According to strict chronology interpretation concerning Abram, Shem Arpachshad, Shelah, and Eber. First four names in the genealogy. Would all have been alive whenever Abram was born. Shem was 450 when Abram was born. Arpachshad was 350. Shelah was 315. We're way back up in the early part of the genealogy now. And listen to this. Eber, he's way back up there in verse 14. Eber was 285 whenever Abram was born, and he outlived Abraham by 4 years. And he's one of the early names of the genealogy here. And he not only was alive whenever Abram's born, he outlived Abraham. Abraham died when he was 175, and Eber lives until he's 464. So he would have outlived Abraham, who came many, many, many generations after him, by 4 years. That is highly improbable. And to cast further doubt upon that is a problem passage over in the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 24, verses 1 to 3 and verses 14 to 15. Here Joshua in his farewell address is saying, verse 2, speaking to the Israelites, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. And I took your father Abraham from the other side of the flood, and led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his seed, and gave him Isaac. Now therefore, verse 14, fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood, and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. If it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, then choose ye this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose lands ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now verse 2, verse 3, verse 14, verse 15 speaks of these people, including Terah, verse 3, including Abraham, as living on the other side of the flood as though they are antediluvians. When we know that all of these names mentioned are the two, Terah and Abram, that come in the genealogy, are post-diluvian patriarchs. But 4 times it says they lived on the other side of the flood. What does that mean on the other side, back where Adam lived? That's the other side of the flood. You're either on this side of the flood, Peter says, or you're on that side of the flood. The world of that side of the flood in that day was different than the world of this day on this side of the flood. 4 times on that side of the flood. Well, it's a poor translation. The word flood there should be translated river. And all it means is on the other side of the river, Euphrates. So that answers a big problem just by getting a right translation. But that's really not what we're after. Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood. Your fathers, plural, verse 2, dwelt on the other side of the flood, or we will say on the other side of the river, Euphrates, in old time. Even Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Now remember, according to strict chronology interpretation, the old righteous messianic link son of Noah, Shem, is still alive at this time. Then are we to assume that Shem, so shortly after the flood, has already fallen into idolatry himself? Well, of course not. But when Joshua says your fathers who dwelt on the other side of the river, and he names a couple of them, Terah, well, he might as well name Shem. Shem's still alive. He's one of the fathers of Abraham. And the other names are Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber. They're all still alive whenever Abram's born. Are we to assume that all of these had already fallen into idolatry? When in chapter 2, or verse 2, then in verse 14, then in verse 15 as well, we're told that the fathers were idolaters on the other side of the river. Now, Terah obviously was, but he's a long way removed from that righteous Noah that had received so much tremendous revelation, who God said in chapter 6 was righteous, and his grace was on him because he was a righteous man. that righteousness and that knowledge of God would have passed down immediately through Shem. Now, if we get moved thousands of years away, by the time we get down to Terah, why, sure, we could be into idolatry. We are told here that we are into idolatry. Terah was an idolater. He was not a worshiper of the God of Shem and Noah. And Abraham was born into that environment. But if strict chronology interpretation is right, then Shem would be an idolater too. And so would Arpachshad, and so would Shelah, and so would Eber. All of those names that were living at the same time that Noah was living. Remember, Noah lived 350 years after the flood. He was living during the time period of Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber, practically all of the people mentioned in chapter 11, if strict chronology interpretation is right. Obviously, it couldn't be right, because all these men, practically all of them, are still alive in Abraham's day, and they all would have been idolaters. And still, according to strict chronology, practically all of them would have been born before righteous Noah died. Wouldn't Noah have passed some godly information on to them, and they all gotten straightened out in their idolatry? Well, if Noah had been dead hundreds of years, and Shem had been dead hundreds of years, maybe we've got enough time for idolatry to have crept in. And no doubt that's exactly what we had. Plenty of time for idolatry to creep in, and for these men to fall from worshiping the true God and the religion of Noah and Shem. And by the time we get to Terah, and by the time we get to Abram, then we have to have God intervening in history in a special manner to get man back on the right track. Now, all of these things point toward one conclusion for internal suggestions and thoughts, and that is strict chronology interpretation simply could not be right by any stretch of the imagination.